Hi, everybody. We are on week 4 now and moving on to question 3. It's me again, not Julia. Sorry, I haven't done away with Julia. She's still here and she'll be doing next week's lesson. So pop over to the chat, first of all, let us know you're here and then come back. We are looking this week at question 3, which is all about structure. So all those things you learned about language, you need to forget when we're talking about this question. So today you're going to be able to explain what's meant by structure by the end of the lesson. You're going to be able to identify and analyse structural features in a text and understand how to answer question 3. So before we do all that, a bit of a recap on last week. So first of all, have a look at these questions and then answer them in the chat. How many points is question 1 worth? How many points is question 2 worth? How many paragraphs should you write for question 2? And can you identify the nouns, adjectives, and verbs in this sentence? And is it a metaphor or a simile? So, my thoughts race through my mind like a speeding train. Is it a metaphor or a simile? And can you underline any, are they nouns, adjectives, or verbs? Okay, so hopefully you got that it is worth 4 points. Question 1 is worth 4 points. Question 2 is worth 8 points. And you should write 2 to 3 paragraphs for question 2. That means, sorry, go back to that. That means identifying 2 or 3 language features or individual words in question 2. Did you get it right? My thoughts race through my mind like a speeding train. The red ones are nouns. There's quite a few nouns there. Thoughts, mind, and train. Train's probably the easiest one. Thoughts is a bit tricky because it doesn't look like a noun because it's nothing you can hold or touch or see. But nevertheless, their thoughts are a thing and they're what's known as an abstract noun. Verb, I think I can only see one verb, which is raced. So race, that's the action in the sentence. And then the adjective is speeding. Now, I've said this is a simile, which is very interesting because certainly like a speeding train is a simile because I'm saying my thoughts are like a speeding train. I'm comparing my thoughts to a speeding train. So that part is a simile, but I've only just noticed, stupidly, that it says my thoughts raced through my mind like a speeding train. Of course, thoughts don't really race. Thoughts can't run, they haven't got legs. So actually, that is a metaphor as well. So the answer is it's a metaphor and a simile. So you couldn't have got that wrong. If you put either of those, they'd both be right. But I must admit, I didn't spot that. But there's 2 things there. There's a metaphor and a simile. Okay, no more trick questions, I don't think. One more kind of recap of last week. Have a look at these two answers to question 2 questions. So the first one is, how does the writer use language to describe the heat? And the second one is, how does the writer use language to describe the landscape? Both things we've done before on different texts. The first answer is the writer uses some brilliant similes. They make the heat seem powerful and strong. It's a dangerous heat that children shouldn't be playing out in. And the second answer is the adjective rancid reminds you of a really strong smell. It means rotten or decaying. So have a look at those 2 answers. There's something quite wrong with both of them. Pause the video and go over to the chat and have a chat about what you think is wrong with both of those statements, both of those answers. Okay, so hopefully you got, in the first one, the writer uses some brilliant similes. Well, she might use some brilliant similes, but we need to know what they are. You can't just say brilliant similes. You've got to say specific similes. So if you said the writer uses the simile, birds were like dried fruit, that would be fine. But you can't just say some similes. We need to know what they are. That is the finding element in the fan paragraph. So you need to find a language feature. Secondly, the adjective rancid reminds you of a really strong smell. It means rotten or decaying. That is absolutely true, but that is just telling me what rancid means. What the question's asking you to do is, how does the writer use language to describe the landscape? So how does that adjective um, add to your impression of the landscape? So we're looking for things like it reminds us of death, it's an overpowering rotten smell, that reminds us of death and decay. It adds a sinister, eerie aspect to the landscape, something like that. So you're not just telling me what a word means, how it relates to the question, whatever the question is asking you. Okay. Right, so for homework, you were asked to read When Did You Last See Your Father? Again, you'd already read this from the point of view of language and you were looking for individual words. That was for question 2. I was asking you to look at it through different lenses this week, through slightly different lenses. I asked you, I gave you this. This is in your handbook, and wanted you to answer these questions on the side. So you're reading it here and answering these questions on the side. So why don't you pause the video and post your answers to some of the questions you were asked to think about for homework. Maybe not all of them because there's a lot, but perhaps post a few answers between you, and we'll see what you came up with. So I came up with this. So the story is told from the point of view of the little boy, who I is the little boy. Sometimes we call this the first person. The first person narrator is an I telling the story. If you're inside somebody's head, and we are very much inside the little boy's head. Where does the action start? Well, it starts in the boy's house, actually on a rug, on a quite a nice, safe domestic scene. Are there any hints that anything might go wrong? Well, yes, when he says, but for how long? But for how long? That implies something's going to go wrong to destroy this nice, peaceful scene that he's a part of. And then where does the focus switch to? Well, we're on the rug, and then somebody knocks on the door. So we all turn and look at the door. The door becomes the focus of our attention. Which characters are introduced? Well, we have the maids and mother are there. And they show us there's something to be afraid of because they start running, or we can tell that there's something scary going on. The little boy doesn't necessarily know what's happening, but he knows to be scared because of what his mother and the maids are doing, which I think is running away. The soldiers are now introduced, and our focus switches to them and their actions in the doorway. They're kind of shoving mother out of the way and that kind of thing. We then move into father's room. So we go from the nice, peaceful, calm living room on the rug to his father's room, which is a bit more business-like, I think. Kind of a more adult, maybe a masculine kind of place. How does the narrator's role change? Well, if you think at the beginning, he was quite placid and peaceful, and the war was going on around him. Now he's the focus of all the action. And that links to the last point. So what dialogue is introduced and why? Dialogue just means speaking. The soldiers are introducing the main point of the story. They say, when did you last see your father? And they've moved the narrative forwards. The boy can't ignore the war like he did at the beginning of the story. He's now at the heart of it. So I think that one piece of language, that one speech the soldier makes, that one question the soldier makes, really shows us how far we've travelled, or how far the boy has travelled since the beginning of the piece. Okay. So they were all examples of structural features, which is what we are focusing on in this question. Structure is really the building blocks of a piece of writing. It's the order in which events take place, and why. So why has the writer decided to structure it the way they have? And the why is the important bit. So writers, when they begin writing, have a lot of choices to make. Where to start? Will they introduce any characters? Who's going to tell the story? What are they going to focus on? What are they going to look at? Timing, will they set it in the future and do a flashback to the past, or just have a straight narrative all the way through? Are the characters going to think or speak out loud? Will I reveal their thoughts? Um, is anybody else going to speak? Why? When are they going to say that? And how am I going to end the story? Will it be the same? Will I do a nice circular structure so it's the same as the beginning? Or am I going to end somewhere quite different, as we just did in When Did You Last See Your Father? So it's the structure of a text is how it's organized and how its parts fit together. And what we are interested in is why has it been organized like this? What is the writer hoping to achieve? There's a typo there. I didn't mean to write as, I meant to write is, sorry. And on page, I think 19 of your handbook, there's more detail about this. So do have a read through. It can take a little while to sink in. Me and Julia, I've got to say, we did struggle with this when we first came across this question a few years ago. It took us a while to get our heads around it. So I'd expect you to struggle a little bit as well. Absolutely fine. So, in answering question 3, we need to ask ourselves, so how did they choose to begin and end this story? How did the writer choose to begin and end this story? Who's telling the story? What are they focusing on? Who are they focusing on? Does this shift? When and how do they introduce new characters and places? Have they decided to repeat any ideas? This is called a motif. Don't worry if you forget that word. But sometimes writers return to ideas or images, and we will come back to that later on in the class. It might be they constantly refer to the weather, for example. Are they giving you any clues in the text that something will happen next? That is known as foreshadowing. If you think in a film, sometimes there's a big clap of thunder, and we kind of know, it might be going to rain, but also it often gives us a clue that something a bit terrifying is going to happen. It's almost like a warning. So writers do the same thing. They throw in these little hints that something bad's going to happen. There's a list of more of these techniques in your handbook on page 24. But the important thing is, it's your job to think about why the writer has used these features. Why are they effective? And how do they make the text more interesting? So again, maybe you won't be pleased to know, but we use the same technique to answer the question. The question will always be, how does the writer structure the text to interest you? And you think about the whole of the text, and it's worth 8 marks. And you'll be marked on F, finding a range of structural features, analysing their effectiveness, saying why they work, and N, naming the subject terminology. So naming those structural features that we've just been talking about. It might be as simple as saying beginning, the writer begins with, and that's fine, that's naming. But we'll talk more about that in a second. I want to talk about one of those features in a little bit more detail, which is focus and switching focus. So writers choose what they want you to focus on when you're reading. So think about this like a camera pointing at something or somebody and then switching to somebody or something else. So in When Did You Last See Your Father, we start by focusing on the little boy, and the camera switches to the door because there's a knock on the door. So all our focus is switched to the door. And there's a reason for that. There's a reason why writers decide to focus on something. So if I was writing a fan paragraph to the question, how does the writer structure the text interest you, I might say the writer begins by focusing on the boy on a rug at the beginning of the scene. He is clearly relaxed and comfortable, and this domestic scene implies comfort and safety. He's sheltered from the outside world and all its worries of war. The writer is building a picture of gentle innocence untouched by evil and aggression. So we're looking at this little bit. I think the writer started there because it's almost lulling me into a false sense of security. I'm thinking, oh, this is a lovely, nice, cozy scene. And then, of course, it all switches. The focus switches, and the aggression and horror of the war is brought in. So have a go at that. It's quite tricky, but let's see how you get on. Pick one of the structural features we discussed in When Did You Last See Your Father? And analyze it. Do a fan paragraph. Find the structural feature. Analyze why it's important, and name the structural feature if you can. So it's something like the writer begins, the writer ends, the writer focuses on, the writer introduces the character. This shows us that, and that's the important thing. That's your analysis. This shows us that. There is an assignment on classwork that I'd like you to do this on. So pause the video now and go over to the assignment. Of course, ask any questions you want to in the chat. I'm going to focus on another structural feature now, which is known as foreshadowing. Not all writers will use foreshadowing, but it is a technique that's used a lot. And as I said, it's a hint that something's going to go wrong. Are there examples of foreshadowing in When Did You Last See Your Father? Well, there are, and I've just pointed them out earlier, so I've ruined my own question. But when he says, but for how long? So the war didn't touch me, but for how long? That is a hint, a massive hint, that something's going to go wrong. And the war is going to encroach on his life. So here's my example answer for that one. Write a hint that something may go wrong when the narrator says, but for how long? This use of foreshadowing implies that the innocence he speaks of is about to be destroyed. His carefree existence has a limited life. Perhaps the war that he's been able to ignore so far is about to encroach on his life. I would say it is. Okay, I hope this is making sense. Like I said, it can be tricky, so don't worry if you don't get it first time round. You can always re-watch these videos, of course. Jaws. Yes, we're now moving on to. We're still looking at structure. We're going to look at a piece. We're going to look at Jaws, which some of you may have read or seen the film. It's from the 1970s, so it's a bit old-fashioned, but it's still good. As you can see, it's about a shark. So for no, not homework. For now, this here, this piece is in your handbook on page 24, and it's also on the classroom if you can't find your handbook. And I just basically want you to answer the questions. Maybe read through the whole thing first, and then read back through it, answering these questions. You might want to read it 2 or 3 times. So I'm expecting you to go away for a little while now. And read this. When you have your answers, discuss just 1 or 2 of them on chat. And that's a good place also to ask me about any questions you don't understand. So discuss just 1 or 2 of those points when you finish, because otherwise you'll be there all evening writing it all out. Okay, so we'll discuss a few of those points in a second that you came up with. But first of all, what overall effect does the writer want to achieve? Which word do you think sums up the effect of this passage? What's the writer trying to get at here? Is it fear, tension, excitement, sympathy, or nervousness? And how do the structural features contribute to that effect? Just have a think. Don't wait, you can write something down. Have a think for a second or pause the video. I think that tension is what the writer is trying to achieve. And I think I'm going to be able to point out how he does this with structural features. The first one, I think, the first way he tries to achieves tension is by the focus shifts. So if you look back, if you've got it in front of you, you'll see that we constantly switch backwards and forwards from the fish, the shark, to the woman. So we can see we have a passage describing the woman swimming, we have a passage describing the shark, and then we go back to the woman, and then we go back to the shark, and then we keep going backwards and forwards until the passages get quite short, and then eventually they're kind of brought together. She doesn't know; she's very unaware of the shark's presence, but we can see, because we're going backwards and forwards between the two, we can see the shark getting closer. And I think this is very tense. It makes me feel very tense. So that structural feature, that structural technique of switching focus has made me feel a bit tense. So that might be a reason that the writer has chosen to use it. So in the example question, how has the writer structured the text to interest you, for which you would get 8 marks? It will always say this in the exam. You could write about what the writer focuses your attention on at the beginning, how and why the writer changes focus as the extract develops, and anything else that interests you. So I've written a paragraph about focus shift. Have a read of this. I think it's in your handbook as well. And just identify the fan elements. Where have I found uh, evidence of structural features, and where have I analysed them, and where have I named them? Have a think about that. Just do it on your own. No real need to chat, because it's quite an awkward thing to talk about in the chat. Here's my answer. So the writer switches focus. That's a naming, because switch focus is a technical term in this piece to increase tension. That could have been green, actually, because that's a slight bit of analysis, but never mind. He first of all focuses, focus again is a technical term, on the woman in the water. She began to swim. The writer then shifts the focus back to the shark. 100 yards offshore, the fish sensed a change. All these bits are where I found structural features. I'm giving evidence that we are switching between the woman and the shark. The writer has structured it so that the focus shifts backwards and forwards. Again, naming, that's in blue, between the contrasting worlds of the shark and its victim. And then we're getting on to the analysis. This creates almost unbearable tension as we see the shark at first sensing and then preparing to attack the victim. The woman remains ignorant of the shark's presence until it's too late, but the reader gets an increasing sense of anxiety as we can see the shark is about to attack her. Okay, so I hope that made sense. Again, you can always pause the video and reread if you need to, or ask questions. I'm going to go on to talk about another structural feature, which is a motif. Now, as I said, this is a recurring idea or image used by a writer. So in Jaws, the writer keeps returning to the house on the shore. Why does he do this? Why do you think the writer does this? Have a think. Maybe have a little chat in the chat about this. I keep spotting spelling mistakes. Sorry, I put in Jaws, the writer keepings returning to the house. Sorry, that isn't right. I meant keeps. Anyway, have a chat about why you think the writer does this. I think he does it. Maybe you came up with this, maybe you didn't, but maybe the house represents safety. The lights and the house on the shore represent safety, and a hope that she might be rescued. And I think this hope actually goes to create the tension, because if there's no hope of being rescued, there's just no tension. You're not tense. You're not thinking, oh, will she be rescued? Won't she be rescued? You just think, oh, well, that's that then. We might feel very sad or hopeless, but you don't really feel tension. This constant reminder that safety is so tantalizingly near. Maybe this drunk man is going to get out of bed and come and rescue her. That feeling, that hint that safety is near makes it actually very tense. So I would argue again that this motif, this idea of returning to the house, increases tension. You may not agree, but I think it does. So why don't you have a go at writing your own fan answers to the question, how does the writer structure the piece to interest you? I would suggest starting with this one. The writer keeps returning to the image of the house. He uses this motif because, and then you analyze, okay? You analyze that answer. And then I want you to come up with your own example. There is an assignment connected to this on the classroom tab. So pause the video, go away, write your paragraphs, and come back. Hopefully, I'm looking forward to reading those answers. I just want to show you this because this is quite a common mistake that people make. This is an answer to the previous question: how does the writer structure the text to interest you? The extract starts with a couple of lovers on the beach at night. The beach is so white it shone. The atmosphere is romantic and carefree. The woman laughed and took his hand, and together they ran to the beach. This contrasts with what happens later. The woman decides she wants to swim in the sea, but doesn't realise there's a shark there ready to attack. So, have a think, maybe have a chat in the chat room about what's wrong with that. I'm hoping you have noticed that it's not really analysing structure. It's just sort of saying what happens in the story. It is running through the story, putting in a few quotes from the story, not analysing, not really saying what the structural features are and why they have been used. I would suggest this is a better answer. We're just focusing on one bit, which is the beginning. It says the writer begins, it says the writers, I mean the writer begins by focusing on a dark, moonless beach at night. This is interesting because beach scenes are normally set during the day, so we know something unusual, even sinister, is about to happen. The house in the background offers a small beacon of light, indicating that there are some people present in this lonely landscape. So, could have gone further with that, but I think that's why the writer has chosen to start there. If you imagine it was a film, you're watching that scene as a film, you'd be watching it, and you'd think these things would occur to you without even thinking it through properly. You just think, yes, dark beach, something going on here. This doesn't normally happen. So it's sometimes structure isn't as hard as you think, and if you think of it like a film, it might help you. It might help you think of it a bit better. It might not. In the exam, as with question 2, you need to come up with 2 to 3 examples of structural features, so 2 to 3 paragraphs. Some tips: don't retell the story. Don't go, this happened, then somebody else came in, and after that someone started talking. You pick out a few structural features and say why they happened. Other tips: you do not refer to language in this answer. We spent all the last few weeks talking about adjectives and nouns and similes. They are not relevant in question 3. We do not want them. So don't use those. For homework, complete the quizzes. I don't think we've got any quizzes. Ignore that. Instead, read Girl on the Train, which is a new piece of writing. It's in your handbook. And we have an assignment on classwork, and also find out what is meant by onomatopoeia and come up with 1 or 2 examples. Onomatopoeia is actually a language feature, not a structural feature, just to confuse you. But next week in question 4, the structure and the language come back together. They come together again, like the girl and the shark. So I hope that was helpful. Like I said, it might take you a little while to let it sink in. I'm going to post another video on here as well that explains it in a different way by somebody else, which you may want to watch as well. Okay, well, I'm looking forward to reading your assignments, and we will see you next week.